Good morning, folks. We are just letting the webinar populate, letting everyone in. So it'll be a few moments and then we'll get started. I'm Kristin Weiss. I'm the communications coordinator with the LTER Network. And so glad to have you all here today.
Welcome, everyone. Oh, just going to welcome you. We're just getting started. We're waiting until folks join, and when we start to see a sort of flattening of the attendee curve, we'll get started. Kristin, I think I'll start the introduction and the housekeeping. It does seem like the attendees the entrances have slowed down a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, welcome everyone to our third in our series of LTER career panels, virtual career panels for the graduate students and for other early career scientists. And as you know, for those of you who have joined us before, the panels have been focusing on career options outside of, or as we say, adjacent to academia. So today we have five amazing, excellent panelists, and the focus of today's career panel is on science communication. So what's going to happen is when I'm done giving some housekeeping remarks, our panelists will introduce themselves and their jobs and their pathways. And I should introduce myself. I guess I'm Jen Cassell. I'm a synthesis coordinator for the LTER Network Office, and with me, I have Kristin Weiss, who's the communications lead for the office, and she'll introduce herself as well. And I just want to give a shout out before we get started to Cora Johnson of VCR and Brian Kim of Beaufort Lagoon, and also Marty Downs of the office, who have really been instrumental in helping put these webinars together. So I do want to just say a few housekeeping remarks. First off is that we are recording this webinar so that it will be put up on the website later for those of you who may want to recommend it to friends or have to bail out early. Now, a lot of our time today will be spent with question and answer. We've framed it that way. And the best way to do this, really the preferred way, is to use the Q&A function, the Q&A box, that's you can see down below your Zoom window. And you can write your question there. And if you really want to ask a question verbally, you could also just put in the Q&A area that you have a question and you want to ask it verbally. But we do find that so far of our past webinars, just writing the questions there has been really easy and efficient. Now, one thing that you may not know that we discovered early on, in the Q&A window, you can upvote questions, particular questions. So go ahead and keep that Q&A box open and read the questions. And if you have the same question, then you can just upvote that, and that will help us triage the questions, and we'll do our best to get to all of them, at least the highly upvoted ones. Now, we'll do our best as well to direct questions to an appropriate panelist, but if you, and not every one of our five panelists will answer every question. So if you want an answer from a particular panelist, then go ahead and write that in your question, and we'll try to direct it to that panelist or panelists. Also, if you want to identify yourself and your LTR site in the Q&A, that's fine too, but you can also ask questions anonymously. That's perfectly fine. Now, at the very end of the webinar, you'll be receiving a very short survey. It's just a few questions. It doesn't take much time, and we really hope that you can do that and provide feedback for us. So I will turn it over now to Kristin, who will introduce herself, and then ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll get right into it. And while the introductions are going on, feel free to start right in on the Q&A. Okay, Kristin?
Thanks, Jen. So again, I'm Kristin Weiss. I'm with the LTER Network Office. I'm communications coordinator, and it's just been really amazing to host all of these career panels. And today we've got a lineup of really fascinating folks from all across the US and beyond the continental US. So I will just go ahead and introduce their names and let them do their brief intros, and then we'll go into our Q&A. So I'm going to start with Symone Barclay. She's from the National Aquarium, and I'm going to put up a slide, Symone, for you so you get started. Just be a second.
Yeah. Thank you, Kristin. So I know while it's getting pulled up, I can still start talking. So hi, everybody. I'm Symone. I manage the education program at National Aquarium, and I also host a show that NOAA puts out called Ocean Today Every Full Moon. It's called that because it's released every full moon. So it's kind of just to play on that and on tides and things of that nature. So just a little bit about my background. In graduate school, I studied sand tiger sharks. So that shark that you see right there that I'm holding off the side of a boat, that's a sand tiger. I studied sand tigers and sandbars really, and looked at the interactions between them and anglers, so people that fish for them recreationally, and how folks' perceptions of sharks impact their conservation and threats that they face. But after I finished my graduate work, I went on to the Canals Fellowship. It's a marine policy fellowship. And after completing my fellowship, I really wanted to take a little bit of a step back from research and to focus my efforts more into education. And so I started out when I was in high school. I was a volunteer at the National Aquarium because I'm also from Baltimore. So I wanted to go back to Baltimore and decided to run all of the education programs here. And so that's where I am today. So my audience is really school children, teachers, college students. I go from pre-K all the way up through graduate students, and in addition to teachers as well. And I train them on a host of things, and I can get into all of that later, but that's a little bit about me and my story and how I got here.
Awesome. Thanks, Symone. All right. Great. Let's move on to Stephanie Bestelmeyer, who's from the Asombro Institute. Take it away.
All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon. So yeah, I work at the Asombro Institute for Science Education, and we're a nonprofit based in southern New Mexico, and we run the K-12 education program for the Jornada Basin, LTER. And as I suspect you might hear from other panelists, my pathway to this was a little circuitous. I would have to say, going back to my work study positions when I was an undergrad is where I really had my passion kind of come to the forefront. So I worked in a middle school as a teacher's aide and teacher at English and science classes. And then I also had a work study at the San Diego Zoo at what was then called the Center for Reproduction of Endangered Species. And I loved both of them. I loved so many things about both of those positions. So I ended up going to graduate school for research. I went to Colorado State, and it was when I was in Brazil doing research on an endangered species called the maned wolf that I actually had an opportunity to bring some students out into the field with me. And I got to show them how to do radio telemetry and do diet analysis using SCAT and vegetation sampling. And it was all of a sudden, I just didn't even realize that was something that people could do. And I just loved it so much. I got to do both the teaching and really helping students see what's going on at the forefront of research. When I finished my PhD, I was very fortunate to have a position that was open here in New Mexico, and it was the first paid position for this nonprofit. And so now what my team and I get to do, and I've been here now for 20 years, is we actually work with about 20,000 K through 12th grade students each year. We work with them in schoolyards, in classrooms, and then we have a field site where we take them out and really teach them about Hornata research as well as lots of other research. I love that most of the students we work with are underrepresented, so I feel like we always are making a difference and are really at the forefront of thinking about equity and inclusion issues as it relates to science in our community. And I love that I get to work with scientists and really kind of stay relatively up to date on what's going on with the research and then figure out ways to translate that and bring it into the classrooms and minds and hearts of the students and teachers that we get to work with. So I look forward to hearing from everyone else and hearing about some of the questions you all have. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Steph. All right, next on our list, we have Lisa Busch from the Sitka Sound Science Center.
Hi, I am the executive director of the Sitka Sound Science Center in Sitka, Alaska, and we're a nonprofit. We do education and research, and we're a field station. We do a lot of community engagement and science communication. My sort of route to this illustrious position is I studied science in college, but frankly, I sucked at it. I almost triple majored. I really loved science. But as it turned out, what I loved about it was I loved being around scientists. I love the culture of science. I love the celebration of nerdiness and curiosity. And I got a fellowship right out of college with the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Science and Engineering in the Mass Media Fellowship. And that placed me at a little public radio station in Greeley, Colorado, where I fell in love with public radio and learned about storytelling. And from there, I said, I'm not going back to science. I'm going to go on in public radio. And I got a job in Sitka, Alaska as a general reporter. And I worked as a general reporter for a couple of years and then started calling myself a science reporter. I quit the radio station and I didn't study writing in college, so I really needed to get that experience. So I left Alaska for a little while and worked at US News and World Report in Washington, DC, the magazine there, and just learned sort of how magazines work and the formula for magazine writing. Came back to Alaska and just said, I'm gonna do what I wanna do, and if it doesn't work out, I'll get a job fishing or do something else. And I wrote grants for myself to do projects on, one was on Alaska women in science. I did a public radio series on that. And then the next one, which lasted quite a bit longer, was on Alaska natives in science. And then the last 10 years of my science journalism career was working on a program called Encounters Radio Experiences in the North, which was a public radio series hosted by a wonderful cultural anthropologist named Richard Nelson. And then my friends were starting a nonprofit, and they saw that I had written grants successfully, and I was a bit of a community organizer in Sitka. By then I'd fallen in love with Sitka. And so they asked if I would be the director of this new nonprofit, the Sitka Sound Science Center. And that was 10 years ago. And so now I started as the only person really at the nonprofit. And now we have 15 full-time year-round employees, and we're a field station for research, and we do a lot of education programs throughout the community. So thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. Wow, that's an amazing journey. Thanks for sharing. All right, and next we will hear from Howard Forbes. He's with the Virgin Islands Marine Advisory Service.
Hi, everyone. So as Kristin said, my name is Howard Forbes Jr. I serve as the St. Thomas coordinator for the Virgin Islands Marine Advisory Service, which is a mouthful. VIMAS for short. Basically, we operate as the extension arm for the University of Puerto Rico's Sea Grant College program. So we don't yet have our own Sea Grant program. We're working to change that, but soon we'll have our own. But we run a lot of different education and outreach programs here in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So I graduated from here with my BS in biology back in 2010. And I got a master's in marine and environmental sciences, also from the university in I want to say 2014. I took a break in between. But I was hired about 3 months after to serve as the coordinator, and I've been doing that ever since. So there are a few things that I do throughout this job that are consistent in terms of running annual events. As you can see with my background, my research focused entirely on mangroves. Here in the territory, we've lost over 50 to 70% of most of our mangrove forest cover due to clear cutting practices. And so part of what I do is I work with the community to restore and replant a lot of those lost mangroves. We also have issues here where we're dealing with coral reefs. We're prone to hurricanes. But one of the things that we really we're struggling with is a lot of the local population, they don't know how to swim. And so we can't engage them to learn about corals, fish, or why they're important because half of them can't swim. So on the weekends, I spend my time as a swimming instructor teaching kids how to swim so that we can get them to that phase where we can then teach them about why these natural resources are important. But thank you for having me, and I'm really excited to be here, and I'm excited to answer some of the questions that the chat will have for us later.
Awesome, thank you, Howard. And yes, that's a good reminder. Start putting in your questions now. We're almost at that point. We have our lovely last panelist, Karen McLeod from Compass, and I will let her explain what that is.
Thank you, Kristin. And kind of fun to go last because I see the threads among all 5 of us, which is fun. So I am based in Oregon, and I'm the Deputy Director for Compass, which is a nonprofit based throughout the US. And we champion, connect, and support diverse science leaders to improve the well-being of people and nature. So our work is really around how do we support scientists to be agents of change? How do we create opportunities for them to learn new skills around communication engagement? How do we support them to connect with community leaders and journalists and policymakers? And how do we support them to think about how do they want to have impact in the world? I'm also courtesy faculty in the Department of Integrative Biology at Oregon State, and I'm often the token, hey Karen, don't you do something other than research? Can you please talk to our students within the department? So I always enjoy that role, and I'm really glad to be here today. So I've been with Compass a long time. Like Steph, I began this trajectory straight out of my PhD. So I've been with Compass since 2003. Our organization has changed a lot in that period of time. When I started, we focused exclusively on the ocean and ocean scientists, and I've had 6 or maybe 8 job titles within Compass over that period of time. So my background is in field-based experimental ecology. I worked on coral reef fish ecology in the Bahamas and in the Florida Keys before that. For me, my journey was grad school. In grad school, I felt like a misfit perpetually. Like I felt like I was this generalist, big picture ideas person who was constantly being asked to fit into these narrower and narrower pipes. And it was so frustrating for me. And yeah, and we can talk about that more, but I just felt like I was this generalist in a system that wanted me to get narrower and narrower. And I was interested in big ideas and how ideas fit together and how science can actually make a difference. And I knew the entire time that primary research wasn't what I wanted to do. Mostly I just loved being outdoors and being underwater on reefs. And I still remember the day when I had the conversation with my advisor admitting that I didn't want to be on the typical path. So during grad school, I really agonized over what am I going to do. And at that time, in the early 2000s especially, there were not very many of us seeking careers outside of academia, or at least willing to talk about it out loud. So I networked like crazy and tried to find anybody I could who had a PhD who was doing something else. So whether they were in government or in a nonprofit or a science writer, informational interviews, I think, are still such a great way to get a sense of what people's lives are really like and why they're passionate about what they do. I was really fortunate to get to know Jane Lubchenco as a grad student, and she was a really integral part of Compass at that time. And Symone, I was actually on my way to be a Knaus Fellow and turned it down. So I had to decide between that opportunity and working for this small nonprofit where I'd be the first PhD that they had hired. But I felt like it had a lot of promise and possibility, and it allowed me to stay here in Oregon. So for me, I found that my generalist tendencies were actually, and continue to actually be really useful in the real world. And a lot of what I had to get over initially was my own imposter syndrome. I'm a coral reef fish ecologist. Why do you think I can speak about the ocean as a whole? But now my job is about wildfire. It's about endangered species. It's about anything at the intersection of humans and the environment. So what I thought was big then is now exploded into the universe. So I'm happy to talk more about my job later, but thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm excited to hear what you guys want to learn more about.
Thanks, Karen. That's great. I think a lot of us who kind of follow the SciComm science education path are more of that generalist mind, right? So it's nice to hear you can go from being very niche in science to a broader education, outreach, communication sort of field. And we're starting to get questions, but as we populate the questions, I just wanted to ask maybe a few other of our panelists. Karen, you mentioned informational interviews as one great way to learn about careers outside of traditional academia. I'm wondering if any of our other panelists have suggestions on the best ways to learn about these careers, or how did you find out about pathways outside of traditional academia?
Well, I can jump in. I think it's funny. No one grows up wanting to be the head of a nonprofit. I don't know a single little kid that wants to do that. So I think for me, it was more coming to just trying things out, really, and coming to the point where I realized the role of nonprofits in science and how I could combine, what I love about science with contributing something, which is what I feel like nonprofits are really good at, contributing something to the world. That's my answer to that.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I would always tell myself when I was in undergrad and people knew I was studying marine science, they were like, oh, you're gonna work in an aquarium? And I would always say like, no way. Like, I am not gonna work in an aquarium. Like, I do not wanna do that. It seems so basic. Like, it was just not what I wanted to do at all. And I think that that's because a lot of times people don't really know what happens at an aquarium or a science center or any of these like informal kind of learning institutions that are connected to the environment. They think that it's just what you see. So you think it's just, people on the floor that are interpreting exhibits. And if you don't want to do that, or you don't want to take care of the animals, then what do you do at an aquarium, So I think it's really important to think outside of the box and like go a little bit deeper. It's not just what you might see on the surface. There are tons of other opportunities. We work with our community very, very closely with the community. I heard a lot of people talking about having like accessibility and making sure that underrepresented groups are able to access your facility or the research, or to better understand environmental literacy. And I mean, that's literally what I do every single day. Baltimore is, if you don't know, is definitely one of the cities that has a lot of areas of opportunity for growth. And so what we do in education is making sure that we're able to give all students in Baltimore free access to our building. It costs $40 to come to that building. No, people that live in Baltimore don't make $40 to pay for each person in their family to come there and park and eat and all of those things. And so I think it's just important to think about like intersectionality, right? And don't limit yourself.
Yeah, I would add, I certainly didn't imagine that being an executive director would be my dream job, but I didn't know what that meant. And I wish I would have taken the opportunity to talk with more people to really, and I think I would have had to seek those people out. Those were not in graduate school, the people I hung around with. And so I kind of stumbled into this, to be perfectly honest. But as a result, for the last 20 years, I've really worked hard to make sure that I am that person who people can talk to. And one example, so I'm often asked to give kind of career panel type opportunities on various campuses around that we work with. And then our LTER actually gives an opportunity and really encourages graduate students to get involved with our nonprofit and come into classrooms and schoolyards and field trips with my staff to just be that extra set of hands to really, you know, in a lot of cases, graduate students love it, and really it opens up their eyes to these possibilities. And in some cases, which is just as valuable, some graduate students just think, oh gosh, that is actually not what I want to do, which is great. I mean, I think those are both incredibly valuable experiences to have. So I wish I would have done a better job personally of seeking out those opportunities as a graduate student, but I really, you know, hope to foster that openness and hope that graduate students know that they can always come to me to talk about the realities of what my particular position is like.
I think a lot of the other panelists have said kind of the same thing that I was thinking too. When I graduated from this university with my degree, this was not my intended career path. I had no idea that this is what I was going to end up doing. And a lot of the opportunities that I now see that are available in terms of the science communication field, I kind of wish those were available when I was a student. So one of my colleagues, she's really big on wetlands restoration, but she also has been dabbling a lot in marine debris. And she's made opportunities where she, through NOAA funding, has provided funding support to teachers to be able to do these community transfer projects. So the teachers get to come up with these projects where they get to think about how they can address marine debris in their community. And the master's students, same like me, when I was a master's student, I could have been involved in a project like that, go into a classroom and help a teacher. So being able to do things like that really helps to set you forward when it comes to thinking about how can you use, you know, a degree in science communication.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. So we've got quite a few questions rolling in too. So let me take one here that's been upvoted from an anonymous attendee. They say, I'm just wrapping up my PhD, but would really like to break into the science communication, science writing fields. Do you have suggestions for ways to gain experience to broaden my writing and communications portfolios? And I'll throw that out there too, to any of you.
I can take an initial stab at that. I think things like AAAS mass media fellowships and other similar kinds of opportunities are a great way to get your feet wet. And as we talked about before, I think that can be a way to see if that's truly a path that you want to be on or one that doesn't nourish you at all, which I know people who've had both of those experiences, but it's where you're actually placed within a particular entity, like at Science Magazine or at Nature or at various other places like that. I also think within the realm of science writing, it's getting a sense of how much freelancing plays into that world now, because a vast majority of people who are science journalists and science writers are freelancers. So connecting with people who are freelancers to get a sense of what are their lives like and what do they enjoy and not enjoy, because so much of that is actually about being your own business. Like there's the writing, there's the actual writing piece, but then there's also the sort of essentially creating your own business and everything around marketing and putting yourself out into the world. That's quite different than how we are trained as scientists.
Yeah, I guess I would also add that the AGU also has, I think, some science communication fellowships and opportunities. Great stuff there. And then I just, like, from a nonprofit perspective, you know, we would welcome someone who came to us and said, hey, I'm interested in trying to get some writing practice. What can I do for you? And there's lots of little things that you could do to get your chops, you know, sort of sharpen up your blades, so to speak. But in terms of helping with social media and doing blogs and columns for the local newspaper and things like that. And the practice is really, really what makes a difference in good writing. I mean, I can speak to that after 30 years of writing, but you know, I think it's really important to put the ideas down and really practice it. So that's just some ideas.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Lisa. Okay, there's a question that's from Micah, And it's addressed towards Karen, but I do actually think many of you may have something to add to this. Here, some support. Dr. McLeod, you're speaking my language. I feel your misfit status, and I'm not interested in the publish or perish world. Academia is not for me. Beyond interpersonal interviews and networking and conferences, etc., what platforms or listservs helped you to find opportunities? I'm finishing my PhD, but I had never heard of Compass before now, and I'm wondering what else I might be missing. And I think it might be hard to sort of verbally run down listservs and things like that, but we can put some answers. We'll be actually following up on some of these questions if we don't get to them all later. We're going to ask our panelists hopefully to have a little bit of time to hop onto a Google Doc. So to Micah and to the others who upvoted that, we look for resources in a Google Doc later. But does anyone want to throw out a few things now? That's fine. Karen, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. Glad to talk to anyone who feels like a misfit in various ways. When I was at this particular stage in my journey, there weren't any listservs. There were no sort of compilations of resources like this. I think my advice in this moment is all around networking. Like from my perspective, it's getting to know people outside of the current box that you find yourself in, however you define what that box is. So getting exposed to some new thinking and new ideas and new people, whether that's outside of your discipline or outside of your institution or outside of the LTER network. But I think just getting exposure to new people and new ideas can just open your eyes to things that you never would have dreamed about. So when we're hiring, we think about like, how well has this person tried to look outside of their own path? Like, what are the internships and fellowships and leadership development opportunities or things that are totally like outside of science at all that they've tried? And just thinking about how have you sort of tried to round out who you are and get a sense of who you are and what you're passionate about. I know that doesn't directly answer the question, but I'd be happy to add some resources into a Google Doc later on too.
Fantastic. Okay, one more. Well, there's 15 more, but I'll focus on one more here and then turn it over to Kristin. Okay, so where did that, they get upvoted, so they hop in their order, and I had one that I think Steph might be able to start us off on. Oh, here it is. I'm a PhD student and my dream career, oh no, it just hopped again as I was reading. I'm a PhD student and my dream career is community education and outreach. I've considered stopping after I get my master's along the way so I don't get pigeonholed by research. What would you recommend in terms of pursuing master's or PhD? I'm gonna put you on the spot, Steph, but then turn it over to all of you to think about that. And this has been a common question in our career panels for all of the different sorts of careers is, do I go for the PhD? Do I stop at a master's? This idea of pigeonholing, it's been a recurrent theme. So Steph, I hope you don't mind if I start with you.
That's a scary question. So I'm definitely not addressing this particular person or making any recommendations. But, you know, I will say from the perspective of someone who hires now, I know that, you know, we really work hard to not pigeonhole and to not assume that if someone has a PhD that therefore they really don't want to do, you know, the science education work that we're hiring for. What's more important for us is to really look very carefully and to try to get a sense through the interview and getting to know the potential candidate is, do they really have a passion for this job? And that passion, it shows up certainly in your degrees, but it shows up almost as much, if not more, in just how you talk about it. And we love the good stories of the circuitous paths that help people understand what it is that they're really passionate about. You know, on my staff, I don't have anybody who dreamed of working for a nonprofit as a science educator, and everybody's taken a different path. But what has really stood out in the interview process for everyone who's on our team is they've convinced us that this is really what they want to do. So I'm a little bit shirking the question. I completely understand that. But, you know, I guess if a PhD allows you to follow your passion, then do that. But I guess I wouldn't make a decision about stopping at a master's or going for a PhD based on what you think your ultimate job might look like and what they would be looking for. If you know if you have a tighter window of kind of where you want to go, certainly you can ask those questions of those people. But just broadly, I would say, maybe don't worry about that so much. Think a little bit more about what it is you want to do right now, and you know, things will open up. I think a lot of jobs I didn't even know existed, much less could I try to figure out the direct path to get there.
Anyone else want to add to that? Okay. Karen, go ahead.
I just have one more thing. I think it's also important to realize you don't need a PhD for leadership roles within the nonprofit space, especially. So similar to Steph, I think we look for alignment between what really feeds someone, where's their passion, and the kinds of jobs that we are trying to hire them for. So whether or not, sometimes we have positions that require a graduate degree, but we don't specify whether it needs to be a master's or a PhD. And my experience is that a lot of people get PhDs for the wrong reasons. So I always encourage people who are at this inflection point of do I keep going or not to really think about why. What is motivating you? And sometimes it may not be the right things. And to just really think about what is it that is compelling you to keep going on that path or not, and think about how that may or may not align. But I don't think it can be a bad thing either. Like I think people worry about they have a PhD and then suddenly they're not hireable. You may not get any more salary, and you just have to be okay with that. Yeah, that's what I would add.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next highly upvoted question from an anonymous attendee that asks, I love research, but I also love education and communication. Does this field provide the opportunity to do both, or is it usually you just have to go the science path or the communication path or the education path? So,
Symone, I see you nodding vigorously. Do you want to start us off on this?
Yeah,
sure.
Howard
is nodding vigorously.
Sure, because again, I did tons of research through undergrad and graduate school. I mean, like that's all I was doing. My bachelor's is marine and environmental science. My master's is natural resources. And I was on the boat every day for all of those years, catching and tagging sharks. And so I definitely really enjoyed being in the field and doing research. But the beautiful thing I think about, depending on what kind of organization you go into, at least I can speak for where I am right now. The beautiful thing about what I do in running education programs is that at our organization, we give Baltimore City kids an opportunity to go to camp for free every summer, 1 week of camp from grades 5th grade through 12th grade. So we give them a free week of traveling camp. So it's not just like on site. So we take them to Florida, we take them to Maine, to all of these different locations for free, because again, we're about accessibility, right? We plan to take our rising seniors this year to Costa Rica, which is the first time that we have ever planned to take them out of the country, and we paid for their passports. And during all of these camp experiences, we're out in the field. We're giving them exposure. We teach them how to swim. We have them go snorkeling. We do all of these really cool things. That picture that I had on my opening slide of me holding the sea turtle, I got to volunteer. It wasn't through camp, but it was at the aquarium. We have a rehab kind of a program for sea turtles and seals. So you can volunteer and get hands-on experience with that. All of that to say that you don't have to completely give up your interactions with animals. You don't have to let go of all of those things. You can really blend them together. You just have to do a little bit of research on your end to figure out what kind of organization can I do both of these. You might not be able to do it every day. I definitely am not with sea turtles every day, right? But I do know that in the summer, this is my time when I get to go out and I'm going to, you know, travel with this in the summer and get to experience those things. And that, I think, is what keeps me excited, because I know that it's always something different, right? I know that I'm still going to get a little bit of that exposure on the research side, a little bit of interaction with animals, and still be able to have an impact with students. And they get to also, like, that's also, I guess, what drives me when, I think that Karen was talking about like your passion, and Steph was talking about passion. Like, people always say, Symone, like, we can always hear your passion. Like, I'm excited right now just like thinking about it, because I like to see the kids get excited when they see things that they've never seen before. So you do not have to pick or choose. You can have all of it.
Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, you took the words right out of my mouth. So I'm also the director for a summer program here. And unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we had to postpone our summer program. But we're not limited to only doing research with the students. So like Symone, we get the students scuba certified. And I think that has been such an eye-opening experience for the students. Some of these kids have never seen a sea star. They've never seen a coral reef. And we have, unfortunately, a coral disease wreaking havoc on our reefs right now. And so once we figured out, like, you know, doing the research, so we now know that in order for these students to really be able to dive with our research team, they need X type of certification in order to do that. So we provide them with that training so that they're scuba certified and ready. So now they're out there with our research team diving and being the ones actually on the front line, actually addressing the coral disease that we have here in the territory. And so that's one of the ways in which we're able to combine the research and the outreach together. So you're not stuck to just doing one. You can merge the two. You just have to figure out how you can craft that to do that.
I would say too, as some, I run a field station that's research and education, and the researcher who can communicate is so rare. So if you are a researcher and you have a passion for communication and education, and you hone that skill, because I just want to say there's people who you know, say they like it, and then there's those who are really good at it. But if you hone that skill, you are going to be in high demand. I mean, just we have a very well-oiled machine of a scientist in the schools program, where we train the scientists before they go into the classrooms and in science communication, and we train them in classroom parameters. We work with the school district about where we're gonna have those scientists come into the curriculum, so it's all integrated. But like I said, the scientist who can communicate and who is really good on the education side is rare. And so if you work on both of those skills, you're going to be in high demand.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with everything that Symone and Howard and Lisa have said. And I would just add two other things. You know, when you think about research, I mean, a lot of us think about being outside in the field, but also, you know, I know some people, I really enjoyed working with data. And so we found a way to make sure that that part of the research experience is a big part of what we do with our students. And by bringing that in, it aligns very well with education standards and what's kind of needed in the school. So we were also able to bring in that part of the research experience. And then finally, I would just say that there's also a need for research in the effectiveness of, in my case, science education programs. So we're able to think about and really work well with evaluators. And it's a different type of research, but it's a lot of the same skills. Like, how do you really set up a fair study to try to address whether you're achieving your goals or not? So I actually find in a lot of ways, I'm able to kind of scratch that research itch, even though what I do now looks very different than what I did as a graduate student.
Can I add just one like very quick point?
Go
Is
for it.
that synthesis is also a version of research. So often one of the things that we're missing is understanding how all the pieces fit together. So that's one of the skill sets we look for. So while at an organization like ours, you wouldn't be doing primary research, you could be thinking about like, how do we actually take everything we know about something and be able to better communicate it to various audiences by putting those pieces together. So that can be another dimension of a way to maintain being a scientist, but with a really different way of doing it.
Great. So this is a question that actually was in the back of my mind too. So the question is, and this is great because you all have very different, well, not very, but a wide variety of audiences that you work with. And one of the attendees, or several, upvoted them, asked, how did you find the audience or the demographic that you wanted to work with? For example, K to 12 versus college students versus adults versus scientists, and I'll add versus policymakers. I think each of you, have in your introductions have highlighted some overlap in audiences, but also some real differences. Was it a straight path? Did you know you wanted to work with a certain demographic? So I'll throw it out to the field.
I can start with this one. I didn't know I didn't start out thinking this is the audience, but as the director of a nonprofit, we wanted to be community relevant. I mean, that's what we always say about everything we do. We want to be doing locally relevant research. We want the education to be place-based. And so our audience is the whole community. So that's K through 12, that's people in the nursing home, that's preschool, that's families, that's politicians, Alaska Natives. So we have different sort of communication strategies to connect with each one of those different audiences. It makes it really challenging, but really fun, really diverse and really interesting. And like we require every scientist who comes to our facility, who uses our facility as a researcher, to get science communication training from us. They get like an hour and a half of training about storytelling, but knowing your audience is really, really, really important. So every community engagement activity has a different audience and requires a different way of speaking to them, and requires a different story. So anyway, for us, that our whole community is our audience.
Well, oh, go Howard.
So I would say it depends on the program. So for most of the programs that I run, our focus has been mostly K through 12, but we do have some programs that focus on much older audiences. But specifically, one of the things that we pointed out from very early on was that the geosciences is not a very diverse field. And here in the Virgin Islands, we definitely can see that. And we're trying to change that. And it starts with the fact that a lot of these kids, they cannot swim. And so when you think about what a scientist looks like, a lot of these kids have, they know what a scientist looks like, but it's the stereotypical what a scientist looks like. And we, like I said, we're trying to fix that. We ask a lot of kids, what does a career in science looks like to you? And a lot of them will tell you that, it's a doctor or a nurse. They think of medical professions, and they don't know that, this other field exists, research, outreach, being a marine biologist. And so we're trying to hit them when they're early, when they're young. And it means that we're going to follow them for a long time. So for the next 10, 15 years. But in doing so, we have that vested interest. Like in those kids that I told you before that we scuba certified, I have one who keeps calling every day, like, can I go scuba diving today? Can I go scuba diving? And so we've instilled that passion from an early age. And so we know that if we continue providing those opportunities and experiences, that student will then come to the university, study marine biology, hopefully get a PhD. But we've now created, we've instilled marine science as a potential career path in a student who probably didn't think of it before. And so that's why most of my focus is on the youth, because they're the next generation.
Yeah, oh, great. You said lots of things that I was going to say. So I'm going to say slightly different things to just add on. But I mean, I'm going to be very candid in that I came to work at the National Aquarium because I wanted to work with Black kids from the city that I was from, and to make sure that they got to see someone who looks like them, who cares about the environment, who is a scientist. Like, this is what a scientist looks like. I wear hoop earrings. I talk just like you. I wear my hair braided just like you. All of these things. That's why I did it. That's how I knew that that was my audience. And what Howard said about making sure that they see, they know that this is a field that they can go into. We have an exercise where we give kids, like, they get to draw a scientist before they come on this one field trip with us, where they would measure water quality. And every time they draw a scientist, is exactly what you talked about. It's medical professional. And then after they leave, we had them do it again, and they draw themselves, and they draw themselves doing the sampling that they did with us that day, or they draw a picture of one of the leaders who was at their station, because one of the things that I've done through that particular program that reaches all of the 6th grade students in Baltimore is to partner with the historically Black colleges and universities in Baltimore City and get interns from those universities to lead the stations with the middle school students, because I also want them to see, like, people who look like them that are working with them and walking them through, you know, using the equipment and all of those things. And by doing that, a lot of those interns, they aren't science majors. Sometimes they're education majors. They're pre-service teachers. So they want to go into teaching in the classroom usually. But I've actually ended up getting quite a few of them that have said, you know, I didn't really know that I could do something like this in education. I had no idea that this was even an option for me. So my audience is, I guess it's varies, right? It's not just K through 12. It is definitely for college students and teachers and the like, because I want to make sure that we are preparing the next generation, the future. And I really care, I'm going to say it again, I really care about Black people, because they don't know, and we are disproportionately affected by so many things that are happening in our climate crisis and all of those environmental justice issues. And Baltimore has tons of issues surrounding those things. And I really want to make sure that they feel empowered to make a difference, even if they aren't going to be marine scientists, but whatever they do, they're going to at least, you know, have this background. They're at least going to have the environmental literacy in their mind. And so that's really where I am.
That's awesome. All right, thank you guys. So our next most upvoted question from Sochi Claire. I believe that's how you pronounce your name. Please correct me in the chat if that's wrong. She says, I recently took a course on research communication and learned that working in academia after a grad degree can be financially taxing. So because of tuition and potentially, you know, a lack of job availability or low pay for introductory career positions. So I care about doing work that benefits the environment, but realistically, I also need to support my family. Was this an issue for any of you? And how do you find the balance between, you know, being able to support yourself and following your passion? So have any of you struggled with that or found ways through that? Or still struggling with that?
Okay, well, I didn't see anyone else go off mute yet. So I would just say that it can be difficult at times. I won't say that it's not. It can definitely be difficult at times. I have like 3 jobs. Like, I have a full-time job, then I have like a contractor position with NOAA that I do like on the side, and then I have another little side contract. But I think that, and I'm not saying that to say that, you know, like, you need to exhaust yourself and work 5 jobs to keep yourself up and to survive. But I actually had them because it was because I needed a little bit extra money when I first started out. But they also allow me to do different things, things that I don't get to do in my full-time job. Like, I don't get to do like the work that I do with NOAA or through those Ocean Today every full moon shows. I don't get to do anything like that at the National Aquarium. And so there was an opportunity for me to make a little extra money, but also to practice science communication, also to, you know, still have a connection to, you know, learning about, you know, marine topics or the ocean, and connected to other people in the field in a way that I would not be able to be connected through my full-time position. And so that was that's how I look at it. Again, there are lots of opportunities nowadays where you can, do something on the side that can help you, practice. If you want to, someone was talking earlier about wanting to practice like their writing, you can definitely do things like that, while working somewhere else. And of course you can get extra money, but also it can help you to move forward. And I think that's a little bit of a different way to think about it. Not that, you are, desperate for money, because I actually wasn't. But it was just a good way for me to figure out how I can learn more, because I always want to learn more. I always want to, try to be better.
Thanks, Symone. Anyone else have thoughts on striking that balance between pay and what you want to do, maybe even when you first started out?
I mean, I think I would add that, very few people make it rich working at a nonprofit. So I'm just going to lay that out there. But I also the first grant I wrote, I picked my own salary. So I think one thing about working at a nonprofit is or at our nonprofit anyway, we have a business mentality. So no, we don't have the highest paying jobs. I mean, we just don't. But we're trying to run ourselves like a business, which includes wanting to keep people in our organization. So we have to pay them a living wage. We have to figure out how to do that. So that's all part of our business model, and give them maybe they can't get every benefit they're going to get if they work at a university. But they get other benefits. We have 6 weeks of leave, paid leave, just boom, you get 6 weeks when you start. We have this kind of good flexible, I mean, now with COVID, it's really flexible, but we have a flexible work schedule. And we have a lot of benefits that I think I know have been really good for families. So, you can leave work and go see your kid in the school play, that kind of thing. So anyway, I think from my perspective, it's not sort of cookie cutter the way you would go and work for a corporation, maybe a giant corporation or a university, but it's more flexible, and we're very creative. We can be very creative. So there's that.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm going to stay on that theme, skipping down the list a little bit to a question that James asked. What generally determines the funding capacity for your work? What's the balance between grants you have to personally apply for versus funds allocated from other sources? And you all sit in different, very different sorts of NGOs and so forth. So I almost feel like all of you or any of you could take that on.
Yeah, I know at our nonprofit, we generally about 60% of our income comes from grants, which in the nonprofit world, people will tell you don't ever do that. It should be much lower, but we've done that for 20 years. And one of the things we do that I think helps us sustain that percentage is that we work a lot with researchers. And so I often say we're the brokers of broader impacts. So when researchers need to put in an NSF grant, for example, they need to show how is what you're doing in this research going to make a difference. And so we partner with scientists to, we already have the infrastructure and the setup. It's great for us too, because we get that brand new research, that comes in that we can bring into our schools. So, I think ours is very dependent on grants, and I always tell people when we hire them that they have 1 year of guaranteed funding, and then it's contingent on funding after that. But I also say we have never had to downsize our staff because of funding. So we've always been able to sustain people once we make the decision to add on new staff. But I am not going to lie, that is certainly a struggle, and that's the majority of my work is making sure that we keep the funding coming in. So certainly a big part of what I do is write grants and work with foundations and scientists on their agency or NSF and other types of proposals.
I just want to jump in here and just say the money part of running a nonprofit, again, I received no training on this as an undergraduate or a master's student. Just never, never thought that looking at spreadsheets was going to be part of my world when I was majoring in geology and hiking up mountains and things like that. We are about 35% grants at the Science Center, and earned revenue is another thing that it's kind of the golden goose of nonprofits, where you have a service or something that people want that's related to your mission, that where you can actually earn money instead of just kind of like beggars with a cup, on the corner looking for donations. But also community partnerships is another way to for us to earn revenue. So for example, we have a big fish processor in town. They just started a cannery a couple of years ago, and we developed a 1 cent for science program with them. So for every can of salmon, they give us 1 penny. For every can of salmon they sell, they give us 1 penny. And and then they put on their label that they are really interested in science. They have this nice little phrase on their tiny little can of salmon that says something about the Science Center and says something about their interest in sustainability and science. And then they give us what's added up to like about it's about 150,000 a year right now. So that's been really great. But so kind of leveraging community partnerships, I think, is another income source for us. And then foundations and donations from individuals.
Yeah, we're also kind of in the same situation too. We're mostly funded through grants. So I know, like, for us, it's pretty much limited on manpower. Excuse me, on manpower. So right now I'm a staff of 1, and it's been that way for a while, until pretty recently. So we leverage researchers within our department, and so when they apply for large NSF grants or large NOAA grants, they need outreach expertise, and this is where I come in and I provide that experience for those grants. We do get some donations from private foundations, and those kind of help to support like our summer programs, because people want to donate to something that they feel is empowering, especially when it's for diversifying the geosciences. But in terms of like applying for grants, I do a lot of that in my department, at least just to fund some of the things that I want to do. So for the Virgin Islands Marine Advisory Service, we have our 5-year grant cycle for NOAA, and there are things in there that I don't really like doing that much. So I apply for other grants outside of that. So I have some grants through USGS to do water quality science with youth and in the schools. I have some other grants with the federal government, with our local government, to do swimming programs. And then I just recently got some others from a private foundation to purchase some industrial scale glass crushers, because we don't do any recycling here. So I'm trying to implement some new recycling initiatives to be able to make us look better in the community, but also to kind of get people more environmentally aware about some of the things that we're doing. But to answer the question, basically, it's a lot of grants and some portion of private foundations, but it's all based on manpower. If I don't have more people to help, then I can't really do much more than that.
Is any SciComm what we'd consider hard money? I'm hearing a lot of soft money. Karen, you were just about to speak.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say we have an even bigger percentage of funding that comes from foundations for our work. So we're like 80% funded by foundations, about 20% earned revenue. The earned revenue now is going down to something more like 0, because that tends to be for in-person trainings at academic institutions, for government agencies, for nonprofits. So COVID is having some big implications for us. We talk a lot about trying to bring in individual donors, but haven't quite cracked that nut yet. But ours is a blend of also trying to get some government funding. We've had some money from USGS, from EPA, from NOAA, from NSF, but those are harder to come by. I think there are much bigger questions that are swirling around within the SciComm field about whose responsibility is it to actually support and pay for all of this? Because there's a lot of finger pointing. Like, oh, it's not our job. Like, it's not that, it shouldn't be something, it shouldn't be a burden of the academic institutions or the government, or, fill in the blank. So I think there are some larger conversations happening, especially within the foundation community, around where should the support for all of this come from? There's such a growing interest and support for the idea, but who's actually paying for it is a bigger conversation that is happening, because there's, as I said, lots of, well, not me, someone should be supporting that.
What's interesting about that is when you apply for, if you're a scientist, if you're a research scientist and you apply for a grant with the National Science Foundation, you're expected to do science communication, right? Broader impacts and that sort of thing. And that's true of most, federal agencies, and most scientists are not experts at this. So it seems like there could be a better way to do it. And there's an organization in Alaska, the North Pacific Research Board, and they do the same thing. Like every grant, they require their scientists to do some kind of community engagement, community outreach. And we have been having a lot of conversations. They have a new director. Like, why don't you guys keep that money and spend it in a more strategic way, instead of just kind of throwing it out there to the scientists to make another website that no one's going to visit? But
yeah, I think the overall funding for science communication is less than 1%. If you look at it relative to how much funding goes towards research itself versus outreach, education, and engagement around that research, it's like 0.1% or something like that.
Thank you for those really great answers. And also James, who asked the question, wrote in the chat, he wants to thank you all for the fantastic responses. So I want to switch gears a little bit. There's been another question sitting at the top of our list for quite some time now about mentorship. So the question is, did your graduate advisor help you with your journey to work outside of academia? How did you discuss the possibilities of leaving academia with your advisor? And I'll broaden that to perhaps your undergrad advisor or any other mentor. So it's really about your transition, this journey outside of academia, since not all of you went to grad school. So Karen, you mentioned some of this in your introductory remarks.
Yes. I would say my advisor helped me in the ways that he could, but part of it is like, what is that individual's exposure to a world outside of that? Because that's the struggle that a lot of academics have, is that perhaps they have never had any experience or exposure to anything outside of that world. I think I was remembering back to, I decided to have the conversation, I don't want to be a research faculty, and I'm also dropping this big chunk of what my research was, because I was doing some lab work that did not feed my soul. So I wouldn't recommend combining those into a single big whammy conversation. But I think what my advisor did do for me was to help me get exposed to the ways that he was starting to engage with policy conversations around the ocean. And I started to get to go to some things with him. So I think he did support me in the ways that he could. But part of it is, what is that person's exposure and experience and connections to a world outside of the academic world?
I didn't I didn't really have a conversation to tell my advisor that, like, I don't want to go into academia, or I don't want to do research. I think that I did, but like, it was when, like, I defended my thesis and I was like, okay, I'm out. Like, it wasn't like, this is what I'm going to do. It was like, I'm done. But I will say that, and I think what Karen said is like right on par, that, it depends on like what they know about it, because I think it's also, interesting, because my advisor still sends me like research-based jobs, like fisheries biologist, like to this day. I'm like, I don't do that. Like, I'm happy doing what I do. So I don't think that they always even like understand that sometimes, like, we have drawn a line and I don't want to do this anymore. And it's okay. I can still be quite involved in science. I can still do the things that I want to do. I haven't forgotten the things that you've taught me or any of those things. Like, I still carry them with me. I think it's sometimes hard for them to remember that. At least in my situation, it definitely was.
My advisor, my undergraduate advisor, he, I think, saw early on, when I had to take physics twice before I got a D, things like this, but I was still very gung-ho about science. He got me internships and things like that. I worked for WGBH in Boston, and I worked for Channel 7 as kind of like a weird geoscience advisor on some radon project that they were doing. So he really encouraged me to do these other things. And I think that really, even though I didn't know what he was doing, I wasn't aware that that's what he was like kind of steering me in this direction. Science journalism wasn't really a thing. People didn't talk about it as a thing then. This was 35 years ago. But anyway, so in that way, I think it was really good. And then my master's advisor I think wanted me in the program because I was not in academia. So for that, like, I think I was like kind of an advantage to their program that way. I have a master's in Northern Studies. So not your typical must be in academia people.
Yeah, I'm also gonna, I share some of the same concerns with Symone. So I didn't have a mentor who kind of guided me down this path in undergrad or graduate school. So a little bit of backstory. So I was a MARC scholar, a Minority Access to Research Careers. And through that program, I went to VCU to pursue a PhD in pharmacology and toxicology. And I was pipetting cell cultures every day, and I hated it. And I left, and I came back home, and I got my master's degree. And after I graduated with my master's degree, like I said, I got hired for this job. I realized there was a need. Kind of wish that the person who I now consider my mentor was kind of there when I was a student, because she's really been fueling a lot of this in terms of, working with the community. But it helps when you recognize that there's a need, and you just go and you do it. I didn't necessarily need someone to kind of push me, and it just depends on, I guess, your preference. If you need someone to kind of push you, or if you don't, either way works.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I think that shows the importance where if you don't have direct mentorship, these informal interviews and reaching out can really make a big difference. And along those lines, another of our questions is, do any of you have tips for reaching out or networking and making contacts, especially if you're an introvert, which I can relate to. There's actually a lot of introverts in science communication, believe it or not. So maybe some of our panelists can relate. And so what do you suggest in terms of those first steps of reaching out to make contacts, or even to reach out to the communities that you engage in?
Well, I can definitely relate to this because, yeah, I was terrified to just try to cold call someone to ask, or try to make those connections. But what I've come to realize much more now is, and I think you can probably experience it from this panel, this community is just filled with a lot of incredibly nice and passionate people who want to help. That's at the heart of who we are and how we ended up in this field. So I just try to, even now, remind myself of that. And now when I try to reach out to foundations and things like that, it's similar. I just have to remember that just like in this field, there's a lot of people in those fields. They're in it for because they want to help and they want to make a difference. And so if you just start with that mindset and remind yourself, and then just make the call and know that you're doing it to a group who really is going to be receptive to trying to help.
Yeah, I think, asking people for advice, I mean, it's free. You're asking them to share something that they know something about. And I also think, and I've done kind of a little mini study of this with introverts and networking, so I know something about this, but you do have to push yourself a little bit. And I think just as a former journalist, and I am like a natural introvert, but I have, when I go to a party or something like that, I have to push myself. And what I do is I come armed with questions. I have like a few, stock questions where people, once they, start to answer it, they'll go on and on if you let them, and come up with what those questions are in your head, before you make the phone call or before you see someone. And then, just know that when you ask someone for advice, you're complimenting them. It's rare that people don't want to give you their opinion and their advice.
I was just also gonna say, don't be afraid to like reach out to people on social media. If you know that there's like a scientist or someone that you follow, or someone who does outreach or whatever that you follow, and they're pretty active on social, like you see them posting a lot, and you're like, oh, this stuff that this person does is really cool. DM them, because if they're active on social, they're gonna be responsive to you. Like if you don't see them posting a lot, then you shouldn't reach out to them in that way. But if you see them posting a lot, then I mean, use that to your advantage. Say, I've been following you for a while, and I really like, what you share on your story or on your feed. And can I talk to you a little bit more? I think that that's a fine way to do it. A lot of younger students have reached out to me that way, or even college students have reached out to me that way. And I think that has been easy for me, because it's also, I mean, it's social, but you can be a little bit more less formal when you're talking to them. So you don't have to be, it's not as much pressure, as when you're sending an email and you have to write, like be very specific about what you're writing in an email. So don't be afraid to use social in that way. It's about networking. That's what social media is here for.
Yeah, thanks, Symone, for touching on social media as well, which we haven't really touched on much. There's a question that's it's wide-ranging from Sarah Erickson. It's 3 questions actually, and I think we've touched on some of the first 2 parts. So I'll read it, and panelists, you also have access to the Q&A here, so there's a lot here. The first part of this is, does the skill set differ for communication that's focused on education versus community outreach versus journalism? And Lisa, I'll add radio, and so the skill sets, how do they differ? The second we've touched a little bit upon, which is, what advice do you have for communicating to different audiences in different SciComm roles? And the third part of this, I think we haven't touched on as much. Maybe we want to focus there. But for those of you that have switched foci or emphasis from previous roles or from what you studied, what has worked well to prepare you to communicate or educate your audience? This is the part key, on a topic you're relatively new to. So I don't know how to break that down. That third part we haven't touched as much on, but communicating about topics maybe that aren't your expertise or you're relatively new to. Symone, have you had that experience in your broad aquarium setting?
Well, a little bit. We have programs that all have like different themes or subject areas. And so, for example, like we have one, and it's about like different biomes, and I'm definitely not trained. Like my background isn't in there. I was very much focused on like marine science and the ocean. And so I did have to do research, but I think it's a little bit different because it's a program that has like a script. So like I don't have to just like talk off the cusp, like there are things that are outlined for you, because we have to stick to a certain time limit, and there are different things, that you want the kids to do. So for me, that has been the largest part, just preparing myself for like questions. So I do read the script and I do a little bit of research, but I don't have to really become an expert at everything. And I think that is something that lends itself well to me, because I am at an aquarium, a place where we do talk about things that are not only in my only the things that I've studied. We have a rainforest, and I didn't study anything about a rainforest either. So yeah, that's a benefit, I guess, of working at that kind of institution, where you know that if you are going to have to talk about it, somebody's going to give you a little write-up that you can go off of, so you don't have to know everything. But I can see why that would be a little scary, and it is sometimes.
Yeah, I think to follow up on that, I think in science, when scientists are trained, especially in the advanced degrees with PhDs and masters, they are trained to be extremely confident about every single thing they say. And it kind of comes across as arrogant sometimes. And I think it's fair, like if you're not an expert on something, to say that. And it's humbling. I mean, you're sort of demonstrating like, I don't know everything. And that is much more engaging for the audience. And then The other thing that I would say is, and this is like a little different branch, but the, the study of science requires a kind of critical curiosity. And we're curious, right? I mean, generally people in the sciences are curious about whatever it is that we're into, but you can't be just taking everything in and saying, yeah, that's the gospel, that's true. We're critical about these sort of truths that are being developed. And I think in communication, what I always come back to that. I always come back to that theme that, how would science approach this communication endeavor, whatever it is? And that kind of sort of element of being critical and, that kind of shooting holes through an idea and kind of playing around with it and looking for what the weaknesses might be. This is what we do in science. And this is also good communication skills. So, those two things are my pieces of advice on that front. If that makes sense. I don't know, maybe it didn't.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Lisa. We talk a lot about saying, I don't know is perfectly fine. I mean, you don't want to say it 100% of the time, but saying it is actually almost welcome, because we find that a lot of students have a lot of stereotypes about science and scientists, some of which both Howard and Symone mentioned, which I think is great. But one of the other stereotypes they have is that science is something that was done, and we know the answers, and all you need to do is learn the facts. And so sometimes saying I don't know, sometimes it's just because you personally don't know, but sometimes it's because science doesn't know, and that's just a question that we still have that nobody's approached. And I think that is a super important message, certainly for K through 12 students, but I would argue also for adult audiences as well, to try to understand a little better how it is that science comes to know things, and the fact that this is an ongoing effort. And I think that's something we should all be trying to communicate a little better with everyone we reach.
If I can also add to that too. So there's a program that I'm also affiliated with where we try to educate the community here about storm preparation. So it is hurricane season for us right now. And so one of the things that I'm not an expert on is climate science. I mean, I understand it, but I'm not an expert in that field. And so we had an activity where we were talking to people about storm surge and the effects of storm surge. And so there's a book that one of my mentors recommended to me. It's called Don't Be Such a Scientist. And it goes through all the different things that scientists do. And as I read that book, I was like, wow, I do that. Like I do a lot of these things. Reading that book is very helpful. So I would definitely recommend that to anyone. There's another book I'm reading, and I don't have it with me right here, but it's called Gamification. It's the science behind gamification, and people relate to games. There's a lot of science behind video games and just turning regular science activities into games. And that's one of the things we've been able to do with our summer program, is incorporate little video game type activities everywhere we can, when it's meaningful, of course. And that's really been able to improve engagement for a lot of the things that we do.
I was going to build on a few of these threads. I so strongly agree with the being able to admit when it's not your expertise and saying, I don't know. But I also wanted to emphasize the flip side, because a lot of the scientists that we work with are so reticent to admit that they know anything. So if you ask them anything outside of their really narrow expertise, that's not me. Whereas almost everyone other than another scientist actually wants to understand something bigger than your little slice of the puzzle. So I think that's one of the things that we find often with scientists, is helping them get comfortable talking about some of the basic premise of their whole field. Because that's what, whether it's a policymaker or a journalist or a leader in a community, that's what they want to understand. And the other point I wanted to make is just science communication is ultimately all about relating to people. So it is about getting curious about other people. And it's really about getting curious about what do they care about? Like, what are they worried about? What are they concerned about? And how do you find those intersections between what you're trying to bring with what it is that they care about, as opposed to just thinking about what it is that you're trying to bring. So really, it's all about getting curious about who's on the other side of that equation. Who are you really trying to connect with? And what is their world? What do you know about their world? And what do you need to get to know about their world in order to better connect with them?
Thanks. Great thoughts. Kristin, we have about 5 minutes left. So Kristin's gonna pose one quick question to you. You'll all have to answer it fairly
I don't know how quick it is, but I thought it, and just so everyone knows, again, there's a lot of great questions about social media, about what if you're coming from a non-science background into a science research career, how do you incorporate that experience? We're gonna document all those questions on a Google Doc, and we'll respond to those offline and have those available. So we will read your questions. I found a really nice one from Ruby on that I thought would be applicable to a lot of our panelists. So Ruby writes, as people passionate about science and community engagement and education and activism in some cases, how can we create the space to listen to the existing needs and interests of communities or our audiences and our students? So what are some ways we can effectively frame community engagement as participatory and meaningfully increase accessibility and engagement without just prescribing the science? I think a lot of you work in that field, so if you have some final thoughts about that. It's a doozy.
Yeah, it's not perhaps a 3-minute question, but
I think, yeah, it's important to say, maybe you have an example of community engagement in one of your projects that lends itself to this.
I mean, I think for this, I'm just going to start the conversation here, but just for us, it is about, I think there is this model in science of, okay, now here's my science. Now I do my science outreach. It's kind of like the second part. And for us, we are doing this, both of these things at the same time. And so we're asking people, what's important to you? For example, we had a landslide in Sitka that killed people and destroyed property. And people came to us and they said, what can we do? We don't want to have these landslides that kill people anymore. It devastated our community. What can we do? And so we were open to listening to them about, to our community. It's me too, but I'm not separate from that. We were open to listening to people in the neighborhood about how can we develop a system where we know more about landslides and we could maybe have more of a warning system. And so we developed this big research project where we have research scientists who are studying the geoscience, and then we have this whole community engagement part of the research. So anyway, so I guess I'm just starting the conversation, but just kind of having both of those things going on, I think at the same time is important. Listening is kind of key to that.
Yeah. One thing that we have done with one of the largest programs that we have and has gotten the most funds that we've ever received in one of our education programs is when we saw we have a NOAA BWET grant. So it is the Bay Watershed Education Training Program. And so it's to provide a MIWI, which is a meaningful watershed educational experience. I know, sorry, lots of terms, but it's to provide a MIWI because the state says that every student has to leave elementary, middle, and high school with a connection to their local watershed. And when we saw the call for the proposals, instead of us writing something and then just telling Baltimore City, okay, this is what we did, we want to work with your students, we took the proposal and went, the call for proposals, and went to the public schools science office and sat down with them and said, this is what it says. What would you all like for us to do? We want to be, we want to provide the programming, but we want to do it in partnership with you. What do your students need? What does your school system need? And that's how we worked it out. And they always talk about how lots of other organizations don't really do that. They think that they know what you need, and they just decide to come and say, oh, we got this for you, and it's not what they wanted at all. So I think that that's really important. Instead of going in with an idea, ask them, what do you want? What do you think would be impactful for your audience or for your community? That has been the best thing that we've done, I would say. That's the best example I have.
Okay, So we are just coming up to our end time, and I just want to express my extreme gratitude to the panelists and also to the attendees for taking the time and asking these really wonderful questions. And I think it's just been so interesting. So we hope that everyone got something out of it, both sides of the Zoom, if you will. And as Kristin noted, there will be a Google Doc, and we're hoping that the panelists can just take a few minutes maybe and just quickly address a few of the questions that didn't get answered today, you know, if possible. And yeah, so Kristin, do you have anything else to say in closing? Oh, and this will be recorded. Sorry, it will be on the website. Maybe you can mention.
Sure, look out for the recording on our YouTube channel, and we always share that via social media and our website. And just want to reiterate the thanks. I always learn such amazing things from our panelists and appreciate all the time that they provide, and hope this was useful for you all. So thank you so much for joining our series. Take care and have a lovely weekend.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Everyone.